Hello, good morning, colleagues. My name is Nicolas Petit, and I'm the co-coordinator of the cluster on technological change and society with Professors Giovanni Sartor and Giacomo Calzolari, who join us online today. So it's a great honor to welcome Professor Anu Bradford to the EUI today. Anu is the Henry Hell Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia University in New York. She's the author of a lot of research and some pretty famous books. She's the one who coined the expression, the Brussels effect, which has been used time and time again and has become a sort of trademark for a lot of things that the European Union is trying to achieve by means of law and regulation. I personally go back quite a long way with Professor Bradford's work. I've often been impressed by her very broad coverage of everything and anything related to the digital space. I'm not even daring to say economy, that's too narrow. The breadth comes with a lot of deep and sound research characterized by usage of mixed methods, qualitative analysis, of course, but also empirical work. And I am reminded of several works that Anu and colleagues did using quantitative descriptive statistics. That was very helpful. It's, again, something that we tend to be missing when it comes to the study of the digital space. And last but not least, of course, I think Professor Bradford has manifested a very important ability to identify patterns and regularities by usage of very striking concepts and sometimes metaphors for what's going on. And this is indeed what research is about. One last point, and then I'll give the floor and introduce the subject of today's session. There is a fine line between doing research and being a political activist. And this line is, I think, what differentiates a commitment to science and a commitment to something else. And I think Professor Bradford has shown a lot of skill at maintaining a very impactful voice in the policy discussion while remaining very true to the commitment to science, reason, and logic, not delving into ideological calls and arguments. And that, I think, is very helpful. It's a very helpful and healthy reminder and attitude in the very polarized and difficult world in which we live. So without going further into introducing Professor Bradford's work, actually we like to be empirical, so we like to give researchers that we talk about an opportunity to show themselves what they are doing. I will hand over immediately. Anu has accepted to present a paper that discusses the false choice often presented between regulation and innovation. And I can't wait to hear the presentation. So we're going to have 25 minutes of presentation by Professor Bradford, and then there will be a Q&A with the room, including people online who can signal their interest in asking a question. We will close after an hour and a half. The people in the room can stay online as well if they want to have a more informal exchange with Professor Bradford. Anu, thanks for being here.
Nicola, thank you so much for, excuse me, for that extremely kind introduction, and good morning to everybody. Really, really delighted to be here. I apologize for my soft voice. I hope it carries through the presentation, but another reason for you to ask a lot of questions and speak as well. So this paper stems from the broader research agenda around digital economy, and it builds on the latest book that I published this September called Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology. And one of the sort of striking findings when writing that book was really the vast gap there is between the technological progress in the United States and Europe. And obviously somebody who is a firm believer in the European project and a big champion for Europe, it is not a pretty read if you look at the statistics, how much Europeans are behind the US. And then somebody who studies digital regulation, I often encounter this skepticism, especially in the US, is that, well, you guys are just regulating, you are not innovating. And there is this very kind of a false notion that the reason Europeans are behind the Americans in technological innovations is because of their commitment to digital regulation. So I wanted to look further into this particular question and ultimately arrived at the conclusion where I was prepared to try to really challenge the claim and argue that I don't deny that there is a gap between the US and the EU, but I do call into question of what explains that gap. And I don't argue here that all regulation is optimal. But I do argue that there are other more fundamental reasons that really distinguish the US and the EU in terms of their tech ecosystems, and that better, to me, explains why the US tech companies thrive and the European tech companies often falter. So let me try that argument with you today. This is a paper that is not yet published, so I would love to have your comments and particular critical ones and pushback where the analytical framework falls short. But let me just first state the obvious. So even in a casual conversation, many of us, if we went around the table, we could do a couple of rounds and not run out of the names of successful US tech companies. They are very easy to name. But then I think we would probably not even get around the room if we started naming big European tech companies. There are not that many. But at the same time, if you ask around the world where the people can name European tech companies, they can't probably name that, but they all can name the GDPR. So the European regulations are more famous than the European tech companies. But if you actually look at various statistics to substantiate the claim, it is sadly true. So the Forbes 2023 listing of the 100 largest tech companies in the world, if you look at then the top 20, there are 3 European companies on that list. One of them is Accenture, that few of us probably wouldn't even name a tech company. There's SAP and there's ASML, but there are 11 US tech companies on that list. If you take the 70 largest platforms in the world, the European platforms contribute 4% of the market cap of those companies. The US platforms contribute 73% of that total. If you look at the top 100 unicorns around the world, there are only 12 European companies in that list, and 7 of those come from the UK, and only 5 from the European Union. If you look at the quantum computing, the 10 biggest companies investing in that next big wave of technology are American Chinese, not a single European company on that list. And then if you look at investments in AI, the US companies are investing 6 times more than the European companies in AI research. So I think we can all agree that this is not the way we would like the statistics to play out. But now the question is what explains that. I really want to focus on that because I think that is important if we one day want to reverse those statistics or at least try to close the gap to some extent between the US and the EU. So the conventional wisdom suggests that there is a correlation between digital regulation that holds back the European companies. And if you look at then the American digital regulations and European digital regulations, it could plausibly be the explanation because the Europeans are regulating quite heavily, whereas the Americans are not. So in the book, I describe the 2 regulatory models, and I call the American model a market-driven model and the European model a rights-driven model. So the American philosophy about regulating the tech industry is really a techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of the world. So it maximizes free market, free internet, and incentives to innovate. So basically hands over the governance of technology to the tech companies themselves, while limiting the role of the government and its ability to intervene in the markets. And it really manifests itself in regulations like the Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which basically provides a liability shield for these platforms. So if somebody here uploads illegal content on YouTube, it doesn't hold YouTube liable for that. YouTube then remains free to take that down or not take that down. If YouTube doesn't take that down, there is no legal claim against YouTube. But if it chooses to take that down and somebody says, look, you're violating my free speech, YouTube, again, is not responsible. So there's a two-way liability shield that is embedded in Section 230. There's also no federal privacy law in the US. So even though about 130 countries, some count 160, have adopted a GDPR type of privacy law, there is no such data privacy law at the federal level in the United States. The US also has not been able to revise its antitrust laws, even though there have been many attempts to do that. And now only there are some attempts through the courts to test the boundaries of the existing laws in the antitrust cases that have been brought, but we have no idea whether the courts are willing to actually accept those theories of harm. So we really don't see a robust digital regulatory framework in the US. And I think there are several reasons for that. So one is this ideological commitment to market and distrust in government intervention. The second is extensive lobbying that takes place in the US legal system. There's lobbying in Brussels, but it's at the very different magnitude in Washington, D.C. Elections are extremely expensive in the US. You need a lot more money there than you need in Europe, which is why the European legislators can afford to listen to NGOs and companies and other stakeholders to get information about this sector, whereas in the US, you listen to the ones who pay for those campaigns. So lobbying plays a much more important role. Also, there's much more political dysfunction in the Congress in the United States. It's very polarized. And even though the US Congress currently, the two parties agree only on two things. One is that China is the problem. The second is that the big tech is a problem. They cannot agree on what to do about the big tech, whereas we don't see that kind of ideological divisions in the Europe. So tech regulation is supported by different political groups. Okay, so that's the US story. So that explains why we have very little tech regulation in the US. And in Europe, though, under the rights-driven model, the key idea is that the Europeans believe in a human-centric digital transformation, which does require regulation that is based on rule of law and subject to oversight by democratic institutions. It is aimed at protecting the fundamental rights of individuals, protecting the democratic structures of the society, and also ensuring a more fair distribution of the benefits from digital transformation. So the Europeans are proactively intervening to redistribute power away from large platforms to smaller companies, to individual users, and to the public at large. So that has then resulted and manifested itself in extensive regulatory framework for the digital economy. The GDPR is what many would describe the crown jewel or the first big push in that domain, building on the earlier data protection directive. But it's also extensive use of antitrust laws that have been leveraged against the tech giants and now supplemented with the Digital Markets Act. Also, excuse me, the content regulation. So first, the voluntary codes on disinformation and hate speech, but then building up to the passing of the Digital Services Act, so that the Europeans actually have a legally binding way to regulate the content moderation space. And now, in addition to the DMA and DSA, building onto the GDPR, we have the AI Act that is at the final stages of being enacted. There's some wrinkles there that we can discuss. But you really see this, that if you look at empirically in a casual way, you see this massive technological gap, and then you see this extensive digital regulation emanating from Europe and hardly any regulation coming from the US. So it's very easy to make that argument that it is the digital regulation in the Europe that holds the European tech companies back, and it is the absence of that regulation that allows the US companies to succeed. And I am not arguing here that it plays absolutely no role, but I'm trying to rather convince you that something else is much more important than the GDPR. And let me frame it another way. If the Europeans scrapped the GDPR today and decided that let's abandon this trilogue and not adopt the AI Act at all, I can swear there is not going to be a thriving tech industry overtaking the US in 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Something else is going on. Okay, so I make then two kinds of arguments in the paper. So one is if I now try to get to justify why that distinction should not be coming down to the digital economy and its regulation of the digital economy. One is that digital regulations, including privacy and antitrust and the regulation of AI, in my view, can cut both ways. They are not inevitably hindering innovation. They can hinder innovation or they can enable innovation. So there's no one-way relationship there. So let me give you an example from privacy. I think it's absolutely true that the GDPR has imposed costs on companies. And that cost can be diverting resources away from research and development. I'm not worried about the Microsofts of the world and the Googles of the world. They can plenty comply with the GDPR. I'm much more worried about the distributional impact on small and medium-sized companies. For them, proportionately, it is much more expensive to comply with the GDPR. And there are some empirical research now is coming out to actually substantiate that we have seen a decline in innovation because of the GDPR. There's one a study that looks at, for instance, how many apps disappeared from the Google Play when the GDPR came into effect. So if you start looking more closely, the apps that left, many of them were kind of copycat apps that I don't really think we saw a true decline in innovation, that those apps disappeared. So we can't just look at the number of the apps there before and after the GDPR. But I absolutely take the argument, accept the argument that there was a cost on small and medium-sized companies. But also we can see an argument that the GDP has really enabled innovation. And I think that really forces us to rethink a little bit of how do we think about innovation. So first of all, we can really think about market innovation, which just looks at innovation as are the companies making more money? Is this leading to greater economic growth? Are we seeing that kind of efficiency gains that are due to some new innovations? But there's also important research, including I refer to Porter hypothesis that says that, look, when there's regulation that is introduced in the marketplace, that often can impose cost on companies, but that also creates them the incentive to engage in the kind of innovation that allows them to develop the kind of products that are now responsive to the regulation, but that forces them to think anew. So if there's an environmental regulation, the companies have now an incentive to develop their production processes in a way that are more environmentally friendly, but they often then come up with something that is also more efficient. So that can also lead not only to social innovation, meaning cleaner air, less climate change burdens, but also then more market innovation, so better, more efficient practices. And I think that can be said about privacy, is that it can increase social innovation, meaning we see greater privacy protected services and products. But also some companies can really capture a market benefit when they are producing products that consumers find more valuable. So some consumers increasingly find that the more privacy-enhancing products are more valuable for them. They rather have those products, which means they're also willing to pay for those products, which means the companies in the market producing those products can also capture a market advantage. Nobody can deny that Apple has benefited from its pro-privacy approach and offering many technologies that are associated with greater privacy. So I take another example from the antitrust space. So there is a long-standing debate of what is the optimal degree of competition if you want to maximize innovation. There are those economists who say that you need some monopoly rents to be able to really invest in innovation. And also the prospect of being able to achieve and maintain those monopoly rents is the one that gives you incentives. There are others who say, no, you actually you become lazy if you are protected monopolist, and then you don't invest in innovation, and we see less competition and we see less innovation. So that is a long-standing debate. But then there is also a lot of people who offer empirical support who say that look, we see less innovation today when the markets are so concentrated. The digital economy is really in the hands of the few giants, and we see startups emerging, but we can't see those startups actually scale. Then there are others, and I think like Nicola is one of the leading scholars in this debate who has emphasized that, look, we shouldn't just look at these oligopolies as being non-competitive. There's a lot of big tech challenge in big tech, them being a threat to one another if they expand to a neighboring market. And that really maintains the spirit of innovation. And I think that is one of the most persuasive arguments that also then shows that sometimes we should not be attacking these monopolies with oligopolies with antitrust law, because there is some dynamic competition that is still going on. There's another strand in the antitrust debate on what we should do with mergers. So there are many scholars that are worried about killer acquisitions, the idea that every time there is an inventive new technology, the big giants acquire them because they want to kill competition before it reaches them. So Facebook says, okay, there's Instagram, we better acquire it. There's WhatsApp, we better acquire it. And none of these companies grow big enough and can never really challenge these big players. So that is one reason to have a very vigorous merger control regime. But then there are others who say that, look, it also can dampen innovation if you have too aggressive merger control, because then when you are a startup, you know that you may not have these exit options. You may not be able to successfully benefit from your investments if the merger route is closed in terms of for you to exit from your investment. So these are just some examples to say that I don't think there is a straightforward one-way route that says that every time you intervene with antitrust or privacy law, you are going to see less innovation. I think that debate is to some extent unsettled and cuts in both ways. So let me now move to what I think is probably the more original contribution of the paper, whereas in the part where I say that innovation cuts both ways, I mainly rely on existing scholarship. But then when it comes to the question, what then if digital regulation is not the reason, what is then the reason that the Europeans are so behind? And here I offer 4 reasons that I think are more important components of the country's tech ecosystem that really sets the US and the EU apart. And the first one is the absence of an integrated digital single market in the EU. So the market is still fragmented, and it's very hard for tech companies to scale in the EU, whereas the US and China, they benefit from being able to scale in a very fast domestic market. So if you look at European tech companies that reach the unicorn status, so over $1 billion companies, 70% of them have had to scale globally to be able to reach that status. Only 50% of the US tech unicorns ever needed to have an international presence. They were able to become unicorns within the US. Whereas in Europe, if you think about your Amazon and you start as a bookseller in the US, you have pretty much one language. Yes, there's Spanish, but pretty much everybody wants English language books. It's much harder to scale in the EU because there are many different languages. Let's say then you are in the videos on demand business. So Netflix is of the world, or the European smaller competitors for Netflix. The cultural differences just suggest that people in Spain watch different movies than people in Latvia. And it's a much bigger difference than what people in Virginia and people in Michigan watch. So you also need to deal with this fragmentation that is attributable to different consumer preferences. But then there are legal differences. So there's still many legislative hurdles when we have failed to integrate the digital single market. I thought it was striking. This study is a little old, but I haven't seen a more recent one from 2015. Still the time when a lot of these US tech companies were doing much better already then than the European companies. Only 4% of the digital services sold in the EU were cross-border digital services. It's crazy. It's really like not a digital single market that we're talking about. So it's much harder for European tech companies to scale and become big players in Europe. Second argument is the capital markets. Again, not the GDPR story. Much more powerful story is that the European companies don't have access to the kind of capital that the thriving venture capital industry in the US provides. European tech companies primarily rely on banks, and banks are much more risk averse than the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. So venture capital market is much more integrated and much more efficient than the disintegrated or insufficiently integrated capital markets in the EU. There have been efforts to establish a capital markets union, but it's willfully incomplete. It's very hard to say that a Portuguese startup can access funding in Sweden and in Poland and in Germany. They still mainly fundraise locally. So we don't have the efficient capital markets. And I think the venture capital industry is just a massive explanation of why the US tech companies are doing so well. So there's one question, though, I always get is that, well, the capital markets are global, and don't the US venture capitalists, if they see a good European startup, don't they go for that? Like, they don't care which nationality these companies are, but they do care about being close to these companies when they make really big bets. They are much more comfortable when they are in Silicon Valley. They can observe the company. They can be actively involved in managing the company. They realize it has the potential, but they need a new CTO. Well, I know this guy that I went to Stanford with, and he can really provide this. Well, now they need somebody who can do this scaling. Well, I know this woman who I helped with this other company that I invested in. We'll get that woman inside the company. We're going to scale it. It's much harder for them to say, well, there's a startup in Florence, and let me from the distance try to really manage that company when I don't know anybody in that tech ecosystem. So they still like to invest locally because of the informational benefit that there is. There's also this idea why the US venture capital firms are doing so well. They are intermediaries, but who feeds the funds into these venture capitalists? There's massive institutional investors that are allowed to invest in risky assets, including pension funds and university endowments. In Europe, first of all, university endowments are not large enough to be big players. In the US, they are some of the major participants in these venture investments. Pension funds, there are many regulations in Europe that prevent the pension funds from investing in the venture capital, in the tech sectors and other risky assets. Whereas according to some studies, about 30% of the venture funding in the US is actually coming from the pension funds. So these are really big differences. Again, something we don't talk about when we just say that, well, you have the GDPR, so that's why you're not growing. So there's much more, I think, that is behind there when it comes to the capital markets. Excuse me. Then a third reason, so I'm now discussed the digital single market, or rather its absence, the capital markets union being incomplete. The third issue is the attitude towards risk-taking. And that's something you need to be able to take risks if you are going to make like really disruptive innovations. And the US benefits from the mentality that is encouraging, conducive of risk-taking, and the legal framework that really allows the entrepreneurs to fail and try again. So the Europeans are very risk-averse. So entrepreneurship is not as valued in Europe than it is in the United States. You see it just on private investment patterns, just retail investors, the kind of assets that the Europeans hold. They don't want to invest in risky assets. You see it in these various studies. Even if you look at there was an extensive study looking at media conversation in Germany, how negative it was on entrepreneurship, whereas how positive entrepreneurship is portrayed in the media in the United States. But then if you look at also just the culture of failing, failure is often fatal in Europe. It's a personal tragedy when you go through bankruptcy. It's really embarrassing. Whereas in the US, it's the rite of passage. So that's the new beginning that you are setting yourself up for. You fail and then you try again. Americans love the stories of one failure and then a big success after that. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple in 1985, the company he founded in 1976. And after 10 years, he was hired back and he drove Apple to great success. So these are the stories that the Americans love to support. They believe in the second chance. And Europeans just don't. And one reason is the bankruptcy laws in Europe. They are punitive. Often when you go through bankruptcy, you cannot raise funds again. In Silicon Valley, it just shows that you tried hard enough and sometimes you fail, so let us fund you again. And if you look at various studies of the punitive nature of bankruptcy laws by the OECD, the most punitive bankruptcy laws are in Sweden and Portugal and Czech Republic and other European countries, whereas the least punitive bankruptcy laws are in the United States, Turkey, and Canada. So I think that's, again, something that we don't think quite enough. Let me go to my fourth reason, which is you cannot be a top innovator unless you really have the innovators. And there the US benefits from having access to the world's best talent. They are not just hiring from the United States, they are hiring from all over the world. And Europeans haven't had the same kind of culture of embracing diversity and proactively seeking to attract the best minds from around the world to the European labor market. And I think that explains a great deal what the difference is. So let me give you a few examples, anecdotal and sort of broader statistics to show that. So first of all, if you look at the over $1 billion companies in the US, over 50% of them have an immigrant founder. If we look at just the household names, the leading platform companies and their founders, Steve Jobs of Apple is a son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Amazon is a second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk of Tesla is South African. Eduardo Saverin of Facebook, the other co-founder, is Brazilian. And Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, is Russian. So it's a huge story of American commitment to immigration that is making a big difference. And then if you look at just the broader strands of immigration, the European immigrants that are coming, the immigrants that are coming to Europe, about 25% are highly skilled or highly educated, whereas the percentage to other OECD countries is 36%. So the other OECD countries are attracting a highly educated at the greater rate that the Europeans are. So I think that is one issue. But one reason why then these immigrants go to the US. So the universities are a huge draw for many immigrants in the US. So if you look at the STEM fields, which is very critical for tech, about half of the masters and over half of the doctorate degrees in science and engineering are earned by foreign nationals in the United States. The statistics show that 70% of those stay in the US after graduating. And I think that is a major contributor to the US technological base. Let me offer one more statistics and then I close. So if we think about AI, and this is something that I wrote recently about a couple of weeks ago to Financial Times, because there's now a lot of concern of Chinese espionage. And even the Dutch are now working on legislation that will prevent the Chinese citizens from enrolling in PhD programs in the Netherlands in the field of sensitive technologies. This was also done in the United States under President Trump, that had this China initiative that was trying to go after Chinese researchers in the US universities. That to me is extremely dangerous and self-defeating. I don't deny that espionage exists, but if we really start cracking down on Chinese researchers, we are eroding the very asset that can help the technological development. So there's many ways to measure where the AI talent is around the world. But one a nice empirical study that I like was the one where the researchers looked at one of the most prestigious AI conferences in the world. And that is the conference which is just like the thousands and thousands of submissions from top researchers from all over the world. 20% of the papers were accepted. So the researchers looked at what were the institutions from which these top papers came from. 60% were US institutions. So 60% of the top talent in AI come from the US, Stanford and Google being the two leading sources. But even more interestingly, they then looked at those top 20, the research talent, not only the institutions they now work in the United States, but where did those working in those top 60% in the US institutions, where did they get their undergraduate from? 29% from China, 20% from the US, 18% from Europe. Massive brain drain, especially from China, but also from Europe. It's not that Europe doesn't have a talented AI researchers. Many of them go to the US. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, the US brings the research communities, the startup ecosystems very close to the universities. You can actually fund companies within the universities. And the university takes a very small cut if you do. The European universities take a big cut if you do something within the European university. Second, if you then become an entrepreneur after having entered the US labor market through the university system, you also know that you are going to be compensated much better. There are not similar caps in stock options. In Europe, there are caps and then much higher taxes when you are getting some of those stock options. So there are many ways how Europeans in multiple levels of that supply chain of success is holding itself back. And I think that's my big invitation for Europe to really consider those items. So let me end with this. I hope that with this paper, I have, if not completely challenged or debunked the idea that digital regulation would be the culprit why the Europeans are behind the US in technological progress. I'm inviting that conversation to first control for all these other variables that I think are extremely fundamental in explaining the differences. So in many ways, I think I offer normative support for the European ambitious digital agenda, because by abandoning that agenda, Europe is not going to fix its issues around competitiveness. But at the same time, I'm leaving the Europe with a long to-do list on issues that it should take very seriously, and that should really gain salience in the policymaking if the Europeans are willing to catch up with the Americans. And for the Americans, I'm also sending the message that if they were, like right now they are considering, of moving towards the European rights-driven model, that would not dismantle the American innovative culture. That would not undo their capital markets or prevent the migrants from going to the United States or rewrite their bankruptcy laws. There's a lot of reasons for me to believe that ultimately you can still thrive even if there was a federal privacy law or one of those antitrust bills would go through. So let me end there, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Anu. That was great. I was reminded of an anecdote that I experienced when I went to Stanford a few years ago. I could compare the cost of opening a bank account in the US versus the transaction cost of opening a bank account in Stanford. In the European Union, if you want to open a bank account, you need to prove that you have residence. But if you need to prove that you have residence, you often need to have a bank account, which leads you to this very impossible situation in which you cannot open a bank account or you cannot find a residence, which are small hits towards migrating or trying to experience the broader European life. Whereas in the US, when I was at Stanford, I went to open a bank account. I think it took maybe less than 1 minute to do this. And they actually asked me, the first question they asked me, you want to open a bank account? Do you plan to open a startup or something like this? So that was the next question after I want to open a bank account. And I think that attitude probably reveals a lot of the problem that you are talking about here, which are not necessarily about digital regulation, but about other types of cuts that non-digital regulation might inflict on innovation, and that some context-dependent factors about Europe that are not present in the US impose on innovation on top of some degree of or some layer of regulatory hassle, which might not be the dominant variable here. So thanks for this. I really enjoyed the presentation. Now it's time to open up for question and answer. So we have people in the Zoom room and people in person. So can you ask a question? So a question ends with a question mark, I have to say, and also state your name and the organization. I mean, you're probably from the EUI, but there's lots of sub-organizations in the EUI, so it would help to know a little bit where you're from. Okay, we start with you.
So, my name is Jeremiah Nyambinya, from a policy leader fellow from the School of Transnational Governance, the Florence School of Transnational Governance. The question is related to the distributional effects that you talked about. Is there a way to incentivize the big digital companies to share some insights that they develop along the value chain that would inform researchers and policymakers on creating a better or an enabling business environment, and sometimes probably improving some of the regulations, as much as regulation may not be the hindrance to innovation. There could be a little boost that comes from the digital footprint that they have created. And why I'm relating this to the digital, to the distributional effect is that, for instance, Amazon supports a lot of the startups through its AWS. Google supports a lot of startups through its Google Maps. Facebook supports a lot of startups through Facebook Marketplace. So all these smaller SMEs you are referring to that are impacted, if they can't find a way to go around some of these GDPRs and other regulations, it would impact the economy and innovation in a certain sense. So is there a way? Thank you.
Very, very good, Jeremiah. So there's a couple of ways that I can think of. So one is that companies like Microsoft and Apple often, they're committed to privacy by design, which means that they are designing their products at the outset to be privacy compliant. So anybody in the supply chain that then uses their products already gets them so that they are GDPR compliant. So I think if that to some extent then makes sure that in that, or the point of origin, the compliance costs have been embedded in the product. So that's, I think, one thing. Another issue is that I'm really glad you asked about the distributional issue, because I think that is really enormous and it worries me in the AI space as well. So there's some suggestion where the GDPR is hampering the ability of small startups to use the data. We all know that if you want to develop these models, you need a lot of data. And if you're a small company, you don't have a lot of your own data. And the GDPR makes it harder to use third company data. And they really are relying on third company data. So the bigger companies, one question is, can they somehow share or be made to share some of their data in a way that is also usable for smaller companies, so that we would get around some of that. So I think there's a lot to be said about sort of data sharing in general and how we can do it in the GDPR consistent way using anonymized data so that we can also commercially benefit from that. That's, I think, one issue that we should think about. But I think it's a question for regulators. Normally, I ask what the regulators can do to make it cheaper for the smaller companies. So in the AI Act, we talk about these sandboxes where they can basically, in a controlled environments, test the compliance of their products with the regulation. But I think what's interesting is your question about what the bigger giants can tell about how they comply. Sometimes it's just that they do have so many people who can work on technologies to address these issues. And the question, can they all be scalable and sort of passed on?
Thank you. So we next have, we're going to collect questions, okay? So we can benefit from additional comments from Anu. So I'm going to ask Yeliz and Yasminka to ask their questions.
First of all, thank you so much. It was really beneficial, and it somehow let me understand the bigger picture between the differences in US and Europe. I'm a fourth-year researcher, by the way. I'm not European. So for me, it's like I resembled a lot of things that you said throughout your presentation as well. And I want to ask you, do you think this lagging behind and the innovations affair, or like, do you think it's embedded in the culture? It is because maybe it's not inclusive to invite more immigrants, or like, is it something to do with maybe not regulations, but more the culture behind the innovation? Because it's like when we go to the roots of it, people like that want to innovate, they start from the scratch, you know? They need to feel imaginatory first and encouraged to innovate. And for them to be encouraged, first, they need to understand the rules and regulations around them. And yesterday we were in a webinar in digital constitutions, and when we talked about DMA and DSA, and they, like, all of the speakers there mentioned that there is a lack of understanding because of the technical words and the regulations from a public sphere. So they don't really understand what they're facing with. So do you think these are all like cumulative effects of why Europe is lagging behind, or do you think it's like somehow harmonized between culture and regulation and incentives? What do you think? Thank you.
So thank you. I think it is a combination. There's not just a single thing. It would be easier to fix it was just a single thing. In terms of regulation, I don't think it's about regulatory stringency. I think it's regulatory complexity. And I think what people often forget if they criticize that GDPR is anti-innovation, you need to think about what the alternative is. The alternative is that it's not that there's no privacy law in Europe. It's that there's 27 privacy laws. And that's even harder for companies to understand and navigate. So often the uniformity and simplicity so that there is an understanding of regulation is particularly beneficial. And if you think about it, the Europeans are more risk averse. They're also pretty risk averse in terms of like their compliance, that they want to make sure that they understand the regulations. But I think there's a lot of cultural issues, as you say. And some of that is harder to capture. So I talk a lot about in the paper how there is this acceptance of failure, even kind of celebrating failure. In the US, Europeans don't celebrate failure. And I think some of that I've been trying to, but I don't really have as kind of an academic take on it. So or the kind of studies that I would support. So it's harder for me to put it in there. But there is the kind of confidence that America teaches you from early on. I see it with my own kids at school. I see how they are like, have these music performances where they have somebody who's just managed to get the first sound of an instrument, go to the stage and make that first sound and everybody's cheering. Next person like is playing a piano concerto and everybody's sort of celebrating them at the different phases of their journey. And like in Europe, it just would be outright embarrassing, probably have that one person make one sound of an instrument in front of the entire school assembly. But they do it because that's all kind of very encouraging. They're very confident very, very early on. And I think what I see in my American students in the classroom, they are very good at intellectual risk-taking, better than European students. They don't care if they say it wrong. Europeans care much more for being wrong. I see it in scholarship too. And that just sometimes means sometimes the Americans really go off the cliff. But, when everybody's sort of chasing the cliff, then some good things really happen. And I think I really see that kind of attitude towards risk and failure. And that's quite cultural. I think that there's a lot of confidence that I have learned in my years in the US, just kind of being at the University of Chicago, where I started my career. I was thrown into the deep end, the pool from day one, and expected to sort of opine on anything. And nobody had sort of greater credibility because they had written a very important paper in the past. It was, what's your market value today? So it was a very kind of non-hierarchical place. And I think that is also a safer place to fail. So I think part of that is really cultural. I also anecdotally heard from people who do deals that the Europeans sell out early. The Americans don't as much. So again, that's probably something to do. That's cultural. I don't cite it in the paper because it was just a conversation. I couldn't really sort of people who do these deals, that's what they know, but I haven't seen a study that I can cite on that. So there's a lot still that is cultural, and I'm not an expert on all those, but I think that's why there's not a single one-dimensional legal fix. Some of that is cultural, but some of that is legal.
Thanks. Yasminka.
Yasminka Pecetić-Kaufman from, I'm Jean Monnet Fellow here at the Schumann Center and University of Zagreb originally. So I just recently, Professor Petit showed me, or actually mentioned a book by a French journalist, economist, I think, Servan Schreiber from the 60s. It's called The American Challenge in English, Le Défi Américain. Very much related to what you are arguing here. And I was reading the paper last night, so I couldn't, stop reading it. So that's why I'm here. But it's a great paper, very interesting, raising so many different issues. So Servan Schreiber was argued that European economic problems in the 60s, particularly the French ones, were not the result of poor fiscal or trade policies, but the direct result of the inability of European companies to compete with American organizations. And then all the McKinsey and others came to Europe to teach European companies how to better organize themselves. So I was wondering whether we have the same situation here. And then, Europe was the cradle of many technological breakthroughs and innovations over the centuries, right? So if you think of great discoverers like Magellan and Colombo, and we had people who were not risk averse, right? And I couldn't help but thinking maybe it's a very blasphemous thought here at the UI, but perhaps when European countries were competing between themselves and there was no integration or intent to integrate deeply, we had less, less risk-averse attitude and more risk-taking attitude. So does regulation make you weak? Integration, does it make you weak? So just some of the thoughts. So I really see your argument about no ideological divide in Europe, unlike in the US on tech companies. Maybe elites here are mobilized against the same enemy. That's why there isn't any clash here. And in terms of effect on innovation, I think you make a great point that we don't really know what is the impact of regulation. You can argue both ways. So you say that tech regulation is unlikely to have one directional relationship to innovation. I think that's a great point. And then in the end, after really great arguments about culture and bankruptcy laws and so on and so forth, you say that it's possible to have both. There is a false choice between tech regulation and tech innovation. So I would like to see in the paper, I would like to hear more on how this can be achieved. This is, I think, just to bring your argument even further, I was missing that in the paper. Thank you.
So very good. I think it would be easier for the US to achieve, basically for US now to pass a data privacy law than for the Europeans to build a capital markets union. I'm afraid that's right, that the problems where Europe would need to shift are quite foundational and take some more time. But at the same time, I don't want to underestimate in the US, there's a deep political dysfunction. We still have functioning political institutions in Europe. So in many ways, I should have more confidence in Europeans being able to enact reforms, because our politics is still working. But in the US, I just don't know what the Congress is able to do. And there's just a tremendous uncertainty around those democratic institutions in the US. So in terms of what I'm advocating for the US to do, it seems like for the Europeans that it is an easy pass, that ultimately they just need to read my paper and listen to all the others and sort of recognize their strengths and take confidence in their strengths and realize they don't disappear, even if they have these regulations. And the public opinion has already shifted in the US. They actually now want more tech regulation. And also in Congress, there are many bills have been proposed. So it shows that kind of the political economy foundation for a change is in the US. It's really now comes down to lobbying and congressional polarization. But I think what it would really take in Europe is that immigration is hard because it's a very charged political issue in Europe. So even if I've been sort of advocating for greater immigration for a long time, I always get this pushback, but Europeans don't want immigrants. But if you think about demographic crisis in Europe, Europe has no choice but to embrace immigration, and not only high-skilled immigration. Europeans desperately need immigrants. And I think Europeans just need to understand that as an existential issue for Europe. So that's, I think, one issue. I think capital markets union, it's one of those two that we have all these studies showing how much we would benefit in terms of just having a deeper capital markets and having that integration. And I think these are kind of big times for Europe to recognize that we probably don't have luxury in today's geopolitical world anymore not to sort of deepen our resources. So then really, like, the rest of the world is taking on, and we are really watching from the sidelines. And I think one is that if you look at, let me try to make this one as a sort of a pitch for why the capital markets union ought to be a priority. Europe now has so many challenges that cost a tremendous amount of money to fix. We also need to think about where that money comes from. So now if you think about that, the Europeans need to pay for green transition, digital transition, rebuild our armies, given what's happening in Russia, rebuild Ukrainian army, most likely the US funding is going to be reduced, rebuild Ukraine. I don't think Americans will do that. The Europeans need to do that. Respond to the greater need for technological sovereignty. We just spent over 40 billion so that we are no longer 90%, but only 80% dependent on foreign semiconductors. And if we are going to really subsidize our way towards greater sort of industrial policy-led technological sovereignty, we don't have the money to do that. Then we just talked about the global gateway, because we really need to compete with China, so China doesn't take on all this influence in Africa and Latin America. That needs tremendous amount of money. So the Europeans don't have the money if there's no growth, and there's no growth if there's no innovation, and a lot of the innovation comes from technology. And we really need to think about that. And what it mostly needs talent and capital. And then where I think the case should be the easiest is the digital single market, because that's the core of what the Europeans do. We don't need any three divisions. We don't need new powers. We just need to realize that's the crown jewel. That's the asset. That's the heart of European growth. So let's invest in that. So in that sense, it shouldn't be sort of inconceivably hard to achieve, but somehow we've been working on this for a long time, and it still takes a lot of time. So I think we move to the territory when these are existential reforms, if we are going to pay for everything that needs to be paid in the coming years.
Hey, Anu, I'm just chiming in here. So, one of the things that we've witnessed a lot in the legal academia and maybe in the policy research as well is there's a lot of priority given to works on distribution more than growth, right? But I often find myself a bit stuck with that change in the, priority of researchers, to the extent that you can't really redistribute if there's nothing on the table to share, right? So this sort of, anti-innovation, anti-growth discourse that is very popular on campuses is actually adverse to the idea of sharing equally, because the only thing that allows you to share is to grow the pie eventually. So, that's maybe one thing to park for the moment, because it's a broad discussion, but I think we need to be aware of the risk that we are taking if we are saying that growth is not the priority and that distribution is the priority, as the stipends from innovation and the surplus that we can get from more becomes increasingly small. Other questions?
I just very quickly say to that, Nicola, I don't think they are alternatives, because indeed, as you say, there's nothing to redistribute if you don't have the pie in the first place. Having grown up in Finland, I'm very committed and very comfortable with redistribution and equality. I think the entire society is very committed to social welfare, but at the same time, it's some of the most competitive. The Nordic countries are some of the most competitive economies. And I think that's absolutely crucial to preserve if they are going to continue to maintain the level of the welfare state and redistribution that they have.
Okay, so I've noted all the hands are raising in the room. Okay, so we had a question from you, and so I'm going to collect them, in groups. So if you can keep them short, in the interest of getting the most from Anu. So we have you. Then I noted Marco. Giacomo has been waiting a lot in the room, so we'll take 3, and then I've written down all the others. Don't worry, Vanessa. Yeah. Okay.
I'm Lorenzo, a master student from the School of Transnational Governance. Thank you, Professor Bradford. My question is, I feel like in your work, there's an implicit paradox whereby the EU's regulation is its power geopolitically, but at the same time, that's a weakness in the sense that we still have a lot of legal fragmentation within the single market. And I wanted to ask if you feel that in many, not only directives, but regulations in the digital market, there's been a lack of ambition to harmonize the legal. I'm thinking, for instance, in the DSA and the great margin that it still leaves for member states to apply content moderation, for instance, according to the laws of each and the regulations of each country. Thank you.
Marco.
Okay, thank you for your paper. I think it casts a powerful image of how many of the problems we are trying to tackle here, the digital innovations, which are not at the end digital problems, which is things that you see also if you look not just at innovation in the US, but innovation beyond, at countries and the global south where innovation has been taking a lot of place, but because of path dependencies might not be at the same level of competition. So one question I would like to bring here is that when you bring up the comparison between US, which is usually portrayed as a more open neoliberal thing, which is market driven, but then you have counter narratives of that history, which emphasize the role of state actors, how DARPA ended up creating ARPA and the internet, military research funding for AI and stuff. And so I don't think that this is really something against your point, but I would like to ask you, how do you think that differences in knowledge transfer regimes between public sector and private sector in the US and you have any role to play in explaining this kind of difference?
And then Giacomo in the Zoom room.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Anu. I'm Giacomo Calzolari. I'm an economist at the UI and one of the co-organizers of the cluster. Thanks again for this really inspiring talk. I agree with most of what you mentioned today, and especially the fact that regulation is not the problem. Now, I also share a sense of urgency that you passed to us in this presentation today, and I completely agree. Urgency from the point of view of the Europeans to move on. Now, when you think about, as you mentioned just after your presentation, the costs of these changes that are needed, the political difficulties that these type of reforms would face, and the urgency. So the three problems together. Then I think as an economist, I would look for priorities. What are your three priorities then, given this daunting task of matching the costs, the political issues, and the urgency? Thanks a lot for your presentation and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Excellent questions. I think it's really interesting how you contrast this idea that regulation is a European superpower. It has been the way to leverage it also internationally and export those regulations, but then how there's still problems with internal harmonization, including implementing those regulations. I think in many ways, the reason why the European regulations have been so successful in providing a template for the rest of the world is that they are designed to work in different member states. So they are not written for America. They are written for 27 countries with different legal institutions, with somewhat different political priorities, somewhat different technological capabilities. So in many ways, they are more giving and they already reflect a compromise. And in many ways, even though these disagreements are making sometimes harder to pass on regulation, they get Europe ultimately into the middle. None of the regulations are that extreme. But it is true that that means that we are more comfortable with the regulations that are either like directives or then that still, even if they are regulations, they are implemented somewhat differently. And I think that means that what we see at the same time is successful externalization of those regulations, but also persisting national differences. And the question, if we really try to draft the regulations so that we can eliminate any discrepancies within the member states, would that come at the trade-off, meaning that then those are more straight-jacketed and less appealing for countries with very different sort of legal, economic, political, cultural, institutional makeups? So I think that's one. The question of Marco of DARPA, I mentioned DARPA in this couple of paragraphs. I didn't now bring it up in the talk that I tried to keep more streamlined, but that's absolutely true. That the US story of funding technology is not just the story of venture capital. It's also that there's been a lot of US state funding that is related to the US's commitment to national security. And Department of Defense runs this agency called DARPA that has funded a lot of innovations, including it funded ARPANET, that was a predecessor to internet. It funded basically email. It provided the seed funding to Apple, which led to iPhone. So in many ways, it would be an absolutely false narrative to only explain that private funding is behind this. But even though there's a lot of state funding, the Americans were very market-driven in how they then distributed the state funding. So it wasn't kind of as dirigist that I'm afraid the European industrial policy is going to be in picking the winners. So I think that was very distributed in a way that still was a little bit more true to the instincts of the Americans. And now we're seeing the US go back to some of the state-driven routes. There's a lot of now in, if you look at the IRA and if you look at the various investments or subsidies to AI, to quantum computing, to cloud, different parts of the sort of the tech ecosystem, especially semiconductors. You see that the faith in the state also fueling technological innovations and investing capital for particularly strategic industries is back. And one question is that, again, where the Europeans are different is that because these are often national security driven investments, we don't have a sort of EU-wide national security policy, and we don't have the kind of common pool funding, sort of common European army. That would, because right now a lot of the technologies like AI, they are dual-use technologies which have commercial and military applications. And that's why I think that there is some benefit in having a sort of a single military sort of national security budget that the Europeans don't benefit from. So I think that's an absolutely important sort of a correction or caveat or a sort of to complete the story that I told about the venture capital. And I have a little bit of that in the paper. And then the third one, oh gosh, the priorities. It's a really good question and very hard. I think one way you think about it is that some of these are short term, some are medium term, some are long term. And that probably would allow us to think about that the political costs don't all materialize the same day. And you need to think about sort of spending the immediate political capital and where you chase the low-hanging fruit, which is a different question than the way it is the greatest net benefit. Sort of if you think about that you introduced that time horizon to it, I think the question is somewhat different. One is that you try to push for easier victories. And that's, I think, the digital single market is kind of should be a priority, because that's something we have the kind of the architecture in place. We could go for rather fast gains. It's just something that politically for a commission to go and say, I am spending 40 billion on semiconductors, it's a splash announcement. Whereas for the commission bureaucrats to go through every law and try to identify all the legal impediments for digital trade, it is not a particularly flashy thing to do. It consists of small victories that collectively can make a tremendous difference. But politically, the gains from doing that work don't lead and they don't culminate in one big, I am doing something big for Europe. So I think you need to also think about that. But I think that's very important. I think the idea of immigration too, it is really important also for the longer term, and it's not just for the tech industry, but that also is kind of a supply chain. You need to think about how universities can attract individuals. How do you allow for family reunification so that you are actually getting the talented people? They don't come if they can't bring their families. And so how do you think the whole pipeline for immigration? So I think I would take it in pieces. So I would absolutely make it a first priority from today that every immigrant who graduates from a European university, including this one, has an immediate path to citizenship. That's the best way to screen migrants that are highly educated and that likely assimilate well because they already go through the kind of cultural adjustment through the time they spend in being educated in Europe. So there are certain chunks you could already take from the immigration puzzle that you move in immediately. And then there are other issues that you build on later on. So instead of sort of saying that the priority is that let's not think about migration, let's think about digital single market. Let's take a piece of the migration puzzle that allows us to get 20% to a better place, and then postpone some other elements of the migration policy that may be a little bit more contested and harder to deal with. But look, I think the capital markets union issue is something that I'm really worried about, and I really think that we should urgently move on to address, so that I also would elevate. But now I'm sort of finding myself in the issue that everything is a priority, and I would not then respect the spirit of your question. So let me end it there.
Anu, I'm just going to throw another remark here related to the point you made in reply to Giacomo. You know, one of the big mistakes that might have been made, we didn't see it coming, might have been to politicize the European Commission, which was initially thought to be an experts organization tasked with diagnosing the obstacles to creating a single market. Now, the incentive structure of people in the Commission might have changed as a result of increased politicization to go for the splash announcements, but not to work on the heavy duty work of trying to identify the 9,000 cuts by which European small and big companies and consumers and citizens cannot afford the benefits of a single market. So I think this institutional discussion about providing the right incentive structure to policymakers in Brussels, and this movement from evidence-based policymaking to political policymaking might be something we need to think more deeply about in the future. We have political actors that might not be well placed when they are based in Brussels. Okay, we can park this and move to Lola and Shamira for their questions.
Thank you very much. I'm Lola Montero, a PhD researcher at the EUI. And I have a question that relates, I have two questions, but starting a little bit with two of the identified issues that you have stated, the digital single market and the capital markets union, those are already very much identified at the EU level. And like the digital single market, I think that since 2015 has been a priority, a policy priority by the union, and the capital markets union, I think from 2020 as well. And there are indeed a lot of reforms, a lot of policy changes, a lot of discussions ongoing. However, it's true that we do not see the matter resolved or accomplished. So even though the issues are stated, they are identified, there are actually a lot of different policy documents, at least that I am looking for at my research, regarding the very specific matters at the preventing a real digital single market. So beyond identifying these issues, what is it that the EU is missing? Why are these issues not being resolved? And especially even for the Capital Markets Union, there are around, I think, 10 different policies that are being either reformed or amended, well, reformed, amended, and updated to fit the needs for investors, for actual strategies to enhance innovation. So what are we missing then? Why are these not actually being translated into the desired policy objectives? That's the first question. If you have any more thoughts, I know that you have a lot in your paper, but how do we move forward? That's a little bit something that I find very frustrating, even as a researcher witnessing this policy evolution. And the second question regards, isn't there a connection between Europe, the EU, as you identified as one of the empires focused on fundamental rights? I do think that there is a connection between this fact and this policy focus, and also intrinsic EU values very much connected to the culture of Europe, to the focus of the individual, of the person at the center of the policy, trust as actually being a policy objective, which is such, well, I would love to see what benchmarks we can actually utilize to see whether we are creating more trust for citizens to actually utilize more digital tools. So given that there is such an intrinsic connection, that as you stated, the pillars of the EU are also connected to the great divergences between the EU member states, then how is it actually possible to have those pillars adapted to the needs of the 21st century while still maintaining the focus of EU values and rights, the fundamental rights that we want to keep at the core of the union, because they are intrinsically connected and linked. So I think it's very hard to let go of one side while still maintaining the ones we want to keep, but still not losing that EU essence, which also in a way can be detrimental for innovation.
I'll ask you to still summarize your second question. I'm trying to get the zest of it, and I want to respect and make sure that I responded correctly. So what are we losing? And how, the question is, how can we preserve the human-centric transformation? But now I don't know, how are we losing?
So how can we preserve the human-centric transformation and at the same time continue being the focus on the digital, the focus on the rights that we have in Europe and the fact that there is so many policy documents that focus on the human-centric approach? Can we keep that while at the same time enhance innovation? Because I think that there is an intrinsic link between the EU values and the EU pillars and the focus on the EU rights, on the human-centric rights. And I don't know if it is possible to maintain that policy focus, human-centric focus, and still modify those parts of the pillar which make the EU perhaps less prone to innovation. Is that more clear, or should I reframe it?
I am not sure that I know. I'm just afraid that I'm still losing. So I understand that we want to maintain the human-centric digital transformation, but are we losing it because we are making so many policy documents that humans don't citizens don't understand what is being regulated?
So how can we continue having that core and modify the parts of the core that prevent innovation?
Also, the modify, focus on bankruptcy laws.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, is the reform agenda that I outlined consistent with the human-centric transformation?
Exactly. Is it possible?
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and then we go to Shamira in the Zoom room.
Thank you. My name is Shamira Ahmed. I'm a policy leader fellow from the Florence School of Transnational Governance. And my question is based on reflections of your previous book on the Brussels effect and ongoing discussions within the room about distribution effects, growth, the burden of regulatory burden on small and medium enterprises. And my question is based on, given that based on the Brussels effect and other factors, the EU now plays, we could argue that the EU plays a role similar to the UN and other multilateral organizations in transferring its standards, values, and norms to other jurisdictions where there needs to be compliance in order to engage with the EU or engage globally in the digital economy. So my question is that given that there is quite an interdependence in the global economy, global digital economy, how much consideration is taken on the developmental agenda and how much impact these regulations have in jurisdictions out of the EU? So within the EU, the issues with these regulatory burdens, hindrances to innovation, and the need to balance economic growth and development, how much considerations are these taken for ecosystems out of the EU, where the ecosystems are completely different, but still impacted by the EU's regulation and decisions and standard norms and values?
Okay, very good. So I can't help, Nicola, but very briefly comment on your observation of the Commission becoming much more geopolitical. I think it has a direct impact on the regulatory agenda. And my fear is that it's really fueling greater sort of industrial policy and techno-protectionism, that the Europeans are now tempted to overplay their hand and use the very asset and the superpower they have, which is regulation, and leverage that towards geopolitical tools, and that will not end well. And that is my concern. And I'm particularly worried about this French-led industrial policy dirigist agenda that is really trying to subsidize our way to competitiveness. And I am not sure we have the money to do that, and ultimately that it serves as well. But also this idea that we would convert tools like competition policy for industrial policy to build European champions. This was the manifesto by France and Germany. And after the Siemens-Alstom merger was prohibited by Commissioner Vestager, that was calling for a greater political involvement in merger control decisions. And here is my warning. So Brussels effect is a tool to export good and bad regulations alike. And if the Europeans are now going to leverage their regulation as a tool for protectionism, that's what we're going to be exporting. And that doesn't serve the European companies well in other markets. So if we decide to now then reject foreign takeovers so that we can keep the European companies European owned, imagine what happens when European companies go and acquire companies in other markets. They may like their national champions fine as well. So while I do absolutely acknowledge that we live in a very different geopolitical environment, we cannot be technologically dependent on the rest of the world. We need to be very careful how we go about that de-risking agenda. And I like regulation. I think that's pretty clear from my writing, but I am not a fan of protectionism. And I do think that we need to be very smart in how do we build those capabilities, those innate capabilities in the ways that actually make Europe stronger. And I don't think that we want to be known as the major export of techno-protectionism. That's not Europeans' path to competitiveness. Oh, yes. Then the question of Lola, Capital Markets Union, I share your frustration because I think you identify exactly correctly. The problem is well known. And the question is, why don't we do anything about it? And I mentioned a little bit in the paper how it just seems to be that there's just a lot that is very nationally embedded, that we have different securities laws, we have different degrees of investor protection, we have different institutions, different market structures, enforcement mechanisms, that actually it does require quite big revisions at the national level, the different aspects of how the markets and capital markets work. So it's probably not simple, but at the same time, given how much effort has been used to identify the problem and kind of commit to resolving some of those, it's regrettable how little progress we have seen in practice. I don't have the real, what I like to do is a proper kind of if somebody has a good piece on the political economy of it, sort of why the change has not been faster, I think I'll be really keen to read that. Then on your second question of whether these necessary reforms, if we manage to carry them out, would that somehow be consistent or lose our focus on the human-centric digital transformation? I don't think so. I think the broader argument in the paper is that there's a false choice. You can have both. You can have the commitment to human-centric, rights-driven digital regulation. I think that's at the center of the ethos of the European project and European view of the kind of digital world that we want to aspire to realize. And we can do it. It's just the difference is that we can also be much more competitive, much more technologically advanced and competitive while still having that agenda. And I think it also gives a certain legitimacy to endorse our regulatory vision if we don't need to fight this battle that we are seen as a regulator of technologies, as a referee and never a developer of technology. So I don't think it should come at the cost of the agenda. So if we try to make that there is a real single market for data, that we can commercialize data, I'm very committed to data protection, but I think we need to think of ways how we can also utilize the data. It's a massive asset and a lost opportunity if we don't commercialize it. We can use anonymized data. We need to do it in a way that is consistent with rights-driven agenda, but that commitment to the rights shouldn't prevent us from finding a GDPR consistent ways to also monetize the data for the benefit of all Europeans. Oh, sorry, was there? Oh, that I forgot. From the online was it Sharmina on this. The Brussels effect of digital regulation and how it plays out, I think, in the global south or developing countries or outside more broadly. And I think that there's a real concern if we recognize the enforcement deficit within the EU with very capable institutions. The EU is having difficulties in enforcing its ambitious agenda. So how can we expect that the countries with fewer human and monetary resources dedicated to the task can really accomplish that? So that would be sort of the question on prioritization of what are the issues that developing countries should do. They probably shouldn't be adopting all the EU laws. They should be gladly, hopefully, free riding in some of these laws and benefiting from the EU, for instance, keeping some of the big players in check. And they should benefit from the Brussels effect to the extent we were just reading last week that Apple was getting ready to comply with the DMA and was considering introducing greater interoperability when it comes to messaging and wasn't planning on limiting that to Europe. So that would be one way that developing countries would not necessarily need to do anything, but they would get the interoperability benefits extended to them. But I think we also sometimes need to ask, and the developing countries can ask the question, is that do they share the same degree of commitment to the rights-driven regulation? And for instance, when they're making choices between accepting Chinese digital infrastructure with greater surveillance capabilities that would be inconsistent with the European rights-driven agenda. And the question that I understand many developing countries ask for a good reason is that why should we turn down the Chinese infrastructure because we need a path to digital development? Our priority, we don't wake up every morning to think about how much privacy we can have. We have dire developmental needs that we need to prioritize. So I think Europeans need to recognize that as well. So for us to ask that a developing country forgoes the Chinese digital infrastructure and rather takes a European, much more expensive 5G network, the question is that why would they make that choice unless they get something tangible from Europeans in return?
Yeah, this is a very, very strong point. I find this, understanding of the sort of geopolitical tension between going for one model against the other, choosing to partner with some countries with certain types of values, and then trying to import some rules which have different values. I think that's certainly an area in which more research is to be done. I had one other remark. I'm just throwing my remarks here. As you see, I'm using my dominant position as a chair for this session. But one is, you were mentioning this distinction between being a referee, a tech referee, and a tech developer. And I was wondering whether, in fact, your ability to craft good regulation might also be conditional on your jurisdiction having homegrown technology. So, there's this best principle that you need some technology literacy to develop good tech regulation. And I wonder whether that also has an impact in terms of sort of maybe small impact, but some impact on the way the EU drafts its regulation without homegrown technology and without maybe the transfers of knowledge from the technological world to the policy environment. But we can park this because we have 4 questions in the room. And in the Zoom room, we have Vanessa, Ivan, and I don't know your name, but you're going to tell us.
Okay, yes, my name is Vanessa Villanueva. I'm Max Weber Fellow in Law. And I actually don't have a question. Mine is a common feedback. And it's coming from someone who studies law and technology, but has a strong focus on securities laws and corporate law. So in your article, which I appreciated a lot, The Cat and the Death, you were mentioning that at some point, EU tech companies receive funding on the first seed, but then they get lost in the process, as opposed to the US, when we have like different type of investors that come into play, which angel investors and other type of investors that provide networking and funding. But there is something that it's missing in this account, which is a tremendous thing that they do, especially in venture capital in startups, which is advice. So they provide service to these tech companies. They don't want them to fail. Failure is part of the learning process, but they don't want them to fail. They want to become the next big thing. And so they provide, they sit in the board of directors, they walk them through this process up until they become big enough to go public. But they do so by exerting a strong impact in how to develop an enterprise. And this is connected also to your account with students and universities, because these are newly minted students from universities. They have no work experience. The only thing that they have is an idea, but they don't know how to run a business. So that was the only small thing that I needed to add to your extraordinary account.
Well, my name is Ivan Romashenko, Max Weber Fellow. Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. My question would be about the effect that has to be taken in order to achieve this success by the European Union. I wonder whether it is the European Commission that should make the first step, or maybe the member states? Because I have an example, for instance, from one country, Lithuania, which a few years ago, there was a bill on the introduction of virtual registered office. It was not passed. One of the reasons was that it was there was an argument that it was contrary to EU law, but it could have somehow fostered the flexibility of establishment of companies and other changes. And also another good example is Estonia, for instance. Of course, I understand that there are certain measures that should be taken by the European Commission, but do you think that maybe to a certain extent it is the member states that have to initiate this movement? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katerina. I'm a master's student at the School of International Governance. And my question is perhaps, I don't know if answerable, but we've talked a lot about how the US culture and the attitude toward risk is culturally reinforcing. But of course, it's also reinforcing the economic factors, and those in itself are economically reinforcing US dominance. What I mean is money creates more money. When we're talking about even the talent in the universities, and we're talking about these big private universities in the US, which get a lot of donations, these endowments that are then used to fund tech companies and startups, but who are also probably run by their graduates, who are also then making those donations to those universities. And so in that way, that is just one example of how in the US, there's just more money being funneled on a regular basis into tech. And at the same time, we have this push, for example, in the EU from France and Germany to maybe introduce subsidies and subsidize as a way to competition, but don't have enough money, as you say. So it feels like a little bit of a dead-end situation where it's almost seems like it might be impossible to catch up in the financial sense, not just to, compete, but even to reach a certain like to start to catch up. So where does this funding come from, and what is the combination of policies which perhaps can include subsidies, but also other policies that would be a way forward to fund this? Yeah.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think that's really, I mentioned it briefly when I talked about the venture capital firms willing to manage these companies closely. That's why they don't necessarily, from Silicon Valley, invest in a startup in Florence, because they want to sit in the board. They want to give the advice. They want this to succeed. But I really appreciate you elevating the importance of that, because I think that is really their role as not just providers of capital. They feed talent, they feed advice, they really help these companies succeed. And I think that's really critical part of their success. And I think you're absolutely right that many of these students, they may have an idea, but nothing would happen if they just were there with their idea. They need the capital, they need the infrastructure, they need somebody who knows how to actually commercialize that. And the question on whether it's in immigration, whether it should be the Commission or the member states, I think because of the competence, this is not really yet an EU-wide policy, or whether it ever will be. Member states are still often in a really critical position to do that. So I would like to see some member states be very proactive. It's a little tricky here because you have free movement, and if you have kind of member state laws, but then you restrict the movement, which is harder than to, it's somehow, it's one of those issues, how we have this kind of misalignment with competencies that are at the different level, and the idea that the migration is the national level issue is somehow in tension with the idea that we want the talent to move within the EU. But there I would like to see that there would be much more initiative also in some member states. But one option is that it's not even member state or the Commission, but there would be individuals. I was super inspired. A couple of weeks ago, I did a panel in Brussels, and I sat in the same panel with this Finnish guy who is the founder of Rovio, so this game company of Angry Birds. And what he's now doing, when he's not actively, I think, running the company, he's very connected with the startup industry in Finland. But his goal is to bring a bunch of foreign students to Finland. He's focusing now on Uzbekistan and Vietnam. He goes and finds them and sponsors them and brings them to Finland. He teaches them Finnish before they come to a Finnish high school for the last 3 years. I met one of his students from Vietnam who was fluent in Finnish. After the 3 years of high school, he connects them with the universities and immediately with a startup ecosystem so they can start studying and engaging in entrepreneurship. I can't remember the numbers. First year he brought 19, the next year 290, then like 3,000. He said he's going to scale this, he's going to make this really big, and it's going to be a success story that hopefully would be scaled at the European level. And nothing seems to hold him back. He's not waiting for commission to get him anything. He was like, I'm going to bring these migrants to Finland and I'm going to help them become entrepreneurs. And he also said there's many of them in countries that want to live in Europe. They want to be free. They want to have the life you can have here. And we just need to really embrace what is our comparative asset, is the life that we can offer to many of those entrepreneurs. And if we are now not that averse to them actually being very successful, let them be very successful. Let them make a lot of money if they happen to be very good and want to make a lot of money. And that, I think, gets me a little bit to Karina's, your question. So yes, it's true that kind of money breeds money, and there's this kind of virtuous circle, if you like, in the US. And let me just note, there's a lot of inequality in the US and a lot of issues that I think we can legitimately be concerned about. There's also a lot of money going in ways that is where that there should be more risk averse. And if we looked at the spectacular failure of the crypto FTX trading, FTX crypto trading, or then the Theranos and the fall of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder. So I'm not just sort of uniformly embracing this kind of recklessness that sometimes go with this lack of risk aversion. But it is true that the Americans are very comfortable with the idea that some people are very rich. Americans are now increasingly uncomfortable because the gap has become very hard to justify when you look at the sort of the struggles in the bottom of the income ladder in the US. But ultimately, the US universities too, they offer a lot of scholarships for students who couldn't afford to go there. And somebody needs to fund those scholarships. So you need to kind of be comfortable with the idea that there are some graduates who've been very successful and who are then very generous donors who give millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. Buildings are named after them, professorships are named after them. But at the same time, that is also one tool to redistribute and educate broader segments of the society. And I think right now, if I look at the conversations in places like Columbia Law School, how much effort we are putting into making sure that we can provide access to the best students, no matter whether they can pay the tuition, and how few actually pay the full tuition, and how many students are on full scholarship. Ideally, it would be even more, but you need to be comfortable with some people being the big donors and some people making a lot of money. And I think that's where the Americans have been more comfortable with.
Thank you, Anu. So we're going to take 2 more questions. There's one question from Michael and one question from Claudio in the Zoom room, and then we'll close the session and have a more informal discussion. Michael.
Yeah, Michael Fitzgerald, a researcher in the law department, and I also want to thank you a lot for your work, which has been really helpful to me in my research. And I wanted to ask, this question goes back to the role of the deep cultural roots of this, or the question as to what role those deep normative or cultural roots have in this. And I wanted to add another ingredient to the discussion, which is that this period immediately after 1990, which David Vogel, for instance, describes as a moment at which the politics and dynamics of stringency shifted from the US to Europe. And so that basically for the last 30 years, since 1990, Europe has been the stringent regulator, and the 30 years before that, the US has been the stringent regulator. So in a whole range of fields, not obviously the digital field didn't really exist, but consumer safety and the environment. And so I wanted to ask about that, because maybe that also supports in a sense some elements of the thesis in the paper, because it says at least that in the US for those 30 years, the regulatory stringency is not it's possible to separate that and to have that while also having a cultural permissiveness towards risk taking. And then also what I'm interested in is like just the real factual causes of what you would think maybe happened around 1990 to cause this. Because I read his book on that, and I kind of thought the description was very I'm still just wrestling with like why that shifted at that moment, and it seems very strange that it was the moment that the internet began to emerge. And I just wondered if you had any insight or thoughts about that.
So then we have Professor Radaili in the Zoom room.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a professor in the School of Transnational Governance. I have two questions. One is about the position of the UK. We haven't talked about what the UK has been doing since Brexit, and what is the kind of prospect for the UK in relation to the empires that you described in your book. And the second question is about the EU not being a single actor, but actually a political system with some tension on these issues between the member states and the Commission. I'm not thinking so much about the non-paper, but about the many times the Competitiveness Council has called on the Commission to utilize and embrace the innovation principle when appraising new regulatory proposals. So the second question would be whether, in order to understand the trajectory of the EU, we should look at these values or perhaps at the political relationship between the Council and the European Commission. Thank you.
Very good, Michael. So David Vogel is wonderful, one of, and I owe intellectually a lot to him, because the Brussels effect builds on his work on the California effect. And indeed, he really documents well that shift that 1990 was when the EU took over the role of the leading regulator from the US, which I think I had not appreciated, but very much would support the argument that I'm making, that those two can be decoupled. The US was innovating before that too, even though it was quite committed to regulation. Though it wasn't regulating as much, there just wasn't, the internet revolution only really started after that, when the US wasn't regulating. And at that point, I think there was just generally, it was the heyday of free trade, and the US really bought into it, that neoliberalism was really on steroids, and the US was leading that. And I think there was just a massive commitment to internet revolution being kind of the big thing that would generate wealth, and nothing was going to stand on its way. And the US was also then exporting this kind of internet freedom agenda. So it was really a main champion of that. But I think another way it reminded me an argument that I mentioned in the book, why I think it's an argument that you can separate them, is that there was very little digital regulation in the EU before 2010. That was kind of a big moment for the Google antitrust case. And then 2016, the GDPR. But before that, there was very little. And if you think about in 2004, 1998, the years when Facebook and Google were founded, there wasn't much digital regulation in Europe then, yet those companies were founded in the US and not in the EU. So I think one needs to also do that to decouple that to some extent. What really caused it, the 1990, I think what Vogel argues mainly is that the issues became very partisan and very polarized. Whereas before that, it wasn't as big, that the Republicans just could not stand regulation after that. So I think that was the big thing in the domain of digital economy. I really would sort of combine that with the heyday of the free trade being seen as really kind of that frictionless trade also in digital goods was how the US was leading this fight. And then the question of the two questions from online, the UK's role, but maybe I take first the Commission and Council, the EU not really being a unitary actor. I think that happens in many levels. Yes, we have different actors within the EU, and then we have the different member states with somewhat different political agendas. And it's true, and the Council and the Commission have not always been on the same page. And I don't know if that's what you were referring to, that right now when there's this new competitiveness reporting, they're both pursuing their own reports, which I think it's a little bit surprising. Let me use that word. And so I don't know how big of an issue that is in the end, but it's something that with the tasks that we have laid out in this session, would require a full commitment of the Commission, of the Council, of the Parliament, of the member states to get this done. Finally, on the UK and its role in the empire, sometimes it's surprising how little probably not surprising how little we talk about the UK anymore, which I think is also something that is a statement in itself. I don't spend a lot of time talking about the UK in the empires. I think for some people, it's already notable that the EU is an empire. The UK is not an empire, the way I describe it in the book. And I think that's just a fact that the UK doesn't have the market size and the clout to be an empire. But if you look at the UK's position on digital regulations, post-Brexit, it certainly hasn't embraced its role as being sort of using the Brexit as an opportunity to unshackle itself from the EU's digital regulations and really carving its own path. The UK has its own online safety bill, which in many ways is as restrictive or more restrictive than the DSA. It's working on a variant of the Digital Markets Act that is also very similar in its commitments. It was the UK out of all the jurisdictions that was holding out the approval of the Activision merger by Microsoft, actually banning it and then walking back. So that shows that the UK is not all bets off Wild West free markets when it comes to antitrust. It hasn't really repealed its data protection provisions, even though it has expressed concerns about the GDPR. Where I see the UK be a little bit closer or even more market-driven, that the US is now after the White House's executive order on AI is AI. And that's where the UK has said we want to be kind of very pro-innovation and pretty hands-off about AI. But at the same time, the UK aspires to be kind of a global convener in the space of AI after its probably mainly successful AI summit. But it's very hard for the UK to lead from behind if the rest of the world is now building the momentum to regulate AI, and the UK wants to be more market-driven, but it's very hard for it then to lead the conversation if the momentum is elsewhere. But my main takeaway from the UK is that in the large scheme of things, how the digital world is shaping up, its interests and values are very much aligned with the EU. And when you think about some of the biggest threats to that European rights-driven worldview, it is the Chinese digital authoritarian way of organizing a digital society. And they're all the techno-democracies where the US and the UK and the EU, alongside with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Korea, Japan, they have a very, very similar set of commitments. And that also kind of shows how the Brexit is not really capturing the true divide or the battles that we ought to be caring about the most.
Thank you so much, Anu. I think we can close the paper discussion here. I think we went very deep into the paper, but also broader than the paper. And that talks a lot to, the depths of the depths and range of your expertise. Again, I'm blown away by how much you cover and how much you cover well. So thanks a lot for being with us today, giving this paper. I know you've been very busy selling the book, if I can use a commercial metaphor, but spreading the word about the book. But this paper is very important, and we'll be looking up to where it's going to be published and the next iteration. So a round of applause for Professor Bradford, please.
Excellent questions, really, really wonderful engagement. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot.